Hey everyone, Darwin's God here. Junk is an important idea for evolutionists. Evolutionists see junky designs all through biology, and they say that those junky designs are very powerful evidence for evolution because God wouldn't have created junky designs, so they must have evolved. Now, I showed you some major problems with that whole argument, but this time I want to look at another major problem, and that is that the argument is subjective. It's not scientific. So let's start by going back to the example we were looking at from Richard Dawkins. Here it is. So in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, Dawkins argues that our photocells in our retinas are effectively wired in backwards. But I showed you some papers that described how that's actually a very sophisticated design. Here's one that says, having the photoreceptors in the back of the retina is not a design constraint, it's a design feature. So not a bug, a feature. And it's folly to think that there's some sort of a problem here. Folly. And we looked at some other papers as well. So you may have been thinking when I showed you these, well, did evolutionists drop this argument then? Well, no, they didn't. So I'm going to show you Dawkins' full paragraph here where he makes this argument. And he ends up concluding, he describes the problem, and then he concludes here, okay, so the light, instead of being granted an unrestricted passage to the photocells, has to pass through a forest of connecting wires, presumably suffering at least some attenuation and distortion. Attenuation and distortion. So, okay, he's laying out some metrics, some measurable, some observable values we can do experiments on. This is a scientific quantity, attenuation and distortion. But wait, what's next? Dawkins realizes that it actually is not a problem. The attenuation and distortion is not a problem. In fact, there really isn't any attenuation and distortion. And so what does he say here? Oops, or actually probably not much, but still, it is the principle of the thing. And so here he makes a flip, a turn. He goes from a scientific argument, or at least a scientific sounding argument, where he talks about attenuation and distortion, and then instead says he refers to the principle of the thing. He appeals to a design aesthetic. The junk evidence argument is subjective. Now here's another example of this. Evolutionist Nathan Lentz in a blog here writes, the human eye is indeed a marvel. A marvel. But if it were to be designed from scratch, it's hard to imagine it would look anything like it does. Hard to imagine. You see, it's subjective. The junk evidence is subjective. Now, an important subcategory of junk and junky designs are vestigial structures, a very common idea in evolutionary thought. And here's a textbook that talks about vestigial structures. So what does it say here? So, when structures undergo a reduction in size, together with a loss of their typical function, that is, when they become vestigial. Okay, let's stop right there for a second. We need to understand this is evolution speak. So when you look at a structure, it doesn't say vestigial on it. And there's no objective criteria for judging whether something is or is not vestigial. It's an evolutionary concept. It's vestigial if evolutionists say it is. So you need to be careful when reading the literature and know what's fact and what's fiction here. So when they talk about undergoing a reduction in size and a loss of function, this is not observed. This is inferred by first assuming evolution occurred. Okay, so let's move on. When structures undergo a reduction in size, together with a loss of their typical function, that is, when they become vestigial, they are commonly considered to be degenerate and functionless. Simpson has pointed out that this need not be true at all. The loss of the original function may be accompanied by specialization for a new function. So the key phrase here is, this need not be true at all. In other words, evolutionists are dropping the requirement that it be functionless. A structure can have sophisticated design, sophisticated function, and still be considered vestigial. Why is it vestigial? Why is it junky? It's the principle of the thing. It's subjective. So how does this work here? Evolutionists keep thinking that biology is full of junk. Scientists keep finding function. So evolutionists backpedal and say, well, function doesn't actually matter. We're fine if a structure doesn't have function. It can still be junky. It can still be vestigial in our view. After all, it's the principle of the thing that matters, not an actual objective scientific measure. The junk evidence is subjective. This is not science.